My name is Elena Carter. I am 38 years old, and for most of my adult life, I believe stability was something you built the same way you build a structure, deliberately, layer by layer, with no room for guesswork. I work as a structural engineer in Austin. Mid-sized commercial renovations mostly. Nothing flashy. Deadlines, load calculations, inspections. The kind of work where if something fails, it fails because someone ignored a small detail early on. I don't ignore small details. 6 years ago, I bought a 2-bedroom house in South Austin. It's modest, but it's mine. Clean paperwork. Predictable expenses, no surprises. That's how I've always lived. That included my relationship. Caleb Hayes is 35. We've been together for 10 years. Not married, but everything else looked the part. Shared routines, shared responsibilities, a life that made sense from the outside. We didn't have children. That was a mutual decision, or at least it used to be. Until recently, we shared everything else. The shift didn't start with betrayal. It started with something much quieter. 3 years into our relationship, Caleb had a minor surgery. Routine, in and out. But the recovery introduced something neither of us anticipated. Prescription pain medication that didn't leave when the pain did. At first, it looked manageable. Then it wasn't. I was the one who noticed the change. The missed doses that turned into extra doses. The mood swings that didn't match the day. The way his schedule started orbiting his next pill instead of anything real. I didn't panic. I acted. I arranged private treatment when insurance started tightening restrictions. I adjusted my project assignments so I could drive him to therapy across town 3 times a week. I sat in family sessions while he described me as controlling, rigid, emotionally distant. I didn't argue. Because part of recovery is displacement. People need somewhere to put their anger. If that somewhere was me, I could handle it. Recovery wasn't clean, it wasn't linear. There were relapses, missing pills, nights where he said things that didn't belong to him, words sharpened by withdrawal more than intention. I didn't threaten to leave. I set conditions. If he skipped therapy, I would call his parents. If prescriptions didn't align, I would remove myself temporarily. I followed through once for 2 weeks, and when I came back, he had corrected course. That's how we operated. Action. Consequence, adjustment. It worked. By last year, Caleb had been sober for 14 months. He credited his therapist heavily. Dr. Merrick, a woman in her early 40s who specialized in addiction recovery. I met her once, one joint session. Calm, measured, controlled in a way I recognized. At the time, I respected that. Looking back, I realized control can wear different masks. The change didn't happen overnight. It started with language. Caleb stopped saying we. It became I need, I want. I'm figuring things out. At first, I told myself that made sense. Recovery strips people down. It forces them to rebuild identity from nothing. Of course, he would focus on himself. That's what healing looks like. But healing doesn't usually come with distance that feels deliberate. His therapy sessions started running longer. What used to be an hour became 90 minutes, sometimes 2. When I asked, he said, recovery isn't a stopwatch. He said it like I had asked something unreasonable. I accepted that explanation longer than I should have, because it sounded logical, and I am used to trusting logic. But I also pay attention to patterns. Structural failure doesn't begin with collapse. It begins with subtle shifts, pressure where there wasn't pressure before. Hairline cracks. At home, he wasn't chaotic anymore. He was precise. If I asked how therapy went, he wouldn't brush it off. He would answer, carefully. Merrick understands things you never did. Not aggressive, not loud. Just placed exactly where it would land. If I suggested we take a weekend trip, something we used to do without thinking, he would say he was focusing on growth, not distractions. Growth, another new word. The first time Merrick's name entered an argument directly was on a Thursday night. I had asked if Caleb was still planning to attend my firm's annual dinner. It's not exciting, but spouses are invited. It matters, in quiet ways. He didn't answer immediately. He rolled his eyes slightly, like I had asked him to regress. Merrick thinks I'm too dependent on your professional image, he said. I remember going still, not because of what he said, because of how he said it. The phrasing wasn't his. I've spent years orbiting your stability instead of building my own, he added. Orbiting your stability. That wasn't spontaneous. That was language someone gave him. I asked him calmly whether that was how he felt or something Merrick suggested. His reaction was immediate. Sharp. You're jealous of the only person who helped me without conditions. That wasn't accurate. My support always had conditions. Because addiction without boundaries becomes chaos. He knew that. But in that moment, he reframed it as control. Over the next few weeks, that narrative hardened. I became the rigid engineer. Merrick became the empathetic guide. I was structure. She was freedom. And somewhere in that contrast, Caleb started drifting. Not dramatically. Not enough to point to one moment and say, that's when it broke. Just enough that I could feel it shifting under my feet. Then one evening, he said something that changed everything. He said he needed space. Not a breakup. Not a separation. Just emotional distance to find himself. He said it calmly, like he had practiced it. I asked what that meant. Practically. He couldn't define it clearly. And that's when something in me shifted from understanding to attention. Because vague language is where people hide things. I didn't accuse him. I didn't raise my voice. I started watching. Not obsessively, professionally. The way I would assess a structure that didn't feel right. And the first thing I noticed was that nothing obvious was wrong. Which is exactly what makes something dangerous. The absence of obvious failure is what makes people complacent. I don't get that luxury. When something feels off, I don't wait for it to collapse. I observe. Carefully, quietly, without interference. Caleb had always left his phone face up on the kitchen counter. It was one of those small habits you don't notice until it changes. Now it was always face down. Not dramatically. Not in a way you could call out without sounding paranoid. Just consistently reversed. He started taking calls outside. Back patio. Late evening. Sometimes mid-afternoon if I was working from home. The first time I walked out to ask him about dinner, he turned slightly away and covered the receiver with his hand. I'll be inside in a minute, he said. There was a pause. Not long, but long enough for me to register the tone on the other end. Low. Female. Not a friend. Not casual. Measured. I didn't react. I went back inside and finished what I was doing. Because reacting too early closes doors you haven't fully looked through yet. Instead, I shifted to something simpler. Verification. I checked our shared credit card statements. Nothing dramatic. No hotel bookings. No expensive dinners that didn't make sense. But there was a pattern. His therapy payments had doubled. Weekly had become twice weekly. He hadn't mentioned that. When I asked him about it later that evening, he didn't hesitate. Recovery isn't linear, he said. Same tone, same phrasing. And you auditing it doesn't help. Auditing. Another word that didn't belong to him before. I nodded. Didn't push. But I adjusted my internal assessment. Because increased sessions combined with private calls, that's not just recovery. That's dependency. Just redirected. A few days later, I asked him something more direct. Are you seeing Merrick outside scheduled sessions? He laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was dismissive. That's exactly the kind of control you don't even realize you're exerting, he said. You don't feel emotionally safe when everything has to be monitored. Emotionally safe. Again. That phrase had started appearing too often. Too precisely. I let a few seconds pass. Then I asked the question that mattered. Are you in contact with her outside therapy? This time, he didn't laugh. He hesitated. Just enough. We talk, he said, when I need clarity. Clarity. Not guidance. Not scheduling. Clarity. That word landed differently. Because clarity doesn't require structure. It requires access. And access is where boundaries dissolve. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse him. I asked one more question. Has she crossed professional boundaries with you? The silence that followed wasn't long, but it was complete. He looked at me like I had jumped too far ahead. Like I had skipped steps. Why do you always go to worst-case scenarios, he said. I didn't move. I didn't soften. I repeated the question. This time he exhaled slowly. I don't know what's appropriate anymore. That was enough. Not a denial. Not confusion. An opening. And I've seen enough structures fail to know, once something starts opening where it shouldn't, it doesn't close on its own. It expands. I stood there for a moment. Then I shifted the conversation. Not emotionally. Practically. The house is in my name, I said. He frowned slightly, like he didn't understand why I was bringing that up. I bought it before we moved in together. The mortgage, the deed, the insurance, it's all mine. Now he understood. You're overreacting, he said immediately. Nothing physical has happened. I nodded. I believe you. And I did, at least in that moment. Because physical isn't where this started. And it's not where it becomes a problem. Then what is this, he asked. His voice sharpened slightly. This, I said calmly, is me not continuing to share a home with someone who is building emotional dependency on another person while calling it self-discovery. His expression shifted. Not guilt. Not yet. Frustration. You're twisting this, he said. This is therapy. You don't get to dictate how I heal. There it was again. That phrasing. I let it pass. I'm not dictating anything, I said. I'm setting a boundary. He laughed again. Short. Sharp. I Your boundaries always come with conditions, he said. Yes, I replied, they do. Because boundaries without conditions are suggestions. And I don't operate on suggestions. I operate on outcomes. I walked to my laptop on the dining table and opened our joint account. He watched me, confused now. I transferred half of our savings into his personal account. Right in front of him. Documented, time-stamped. Clean. What are you doing? He asked. Removing any claim of financial control, I said. He stared at the screen. Then back at me. You're serious. I am. That was the moment the room changed. Because up until then, this had been theoretical, emotional, debatable. Now it wasn't. Where am I supposed to go? He asked. That question came softer, less certain. That's not my responsibility anymore, I said. His jaw tightened. So that's it? He asked. After everything? I held his gaze. After everything, you chose to invest your emotional dependence somewhere else while living here, I said. That has consequences. He stepped closer, not aggressive, just trying to reassert something. You're abandoning me in the middle of recovery, he said. No, I replied. I'm refusing to participate in something that disrespects me. There was a difference. He just didn't want to acknowledge it. I told him to pack essentials. Clothes, documents, anything he needed immediately. I gave him 40 minutes. No yelling. No escalation. Just movement. He moved through the bedroom quietly, pulling things into a suitcase. Drawers opening. Closing. Zippers. The sound of fabric being folded too quickly. I stayed in the living room. Still present. Not interfering. Because once a decision is made, dragging it out only creates confusion. When he finished, he stood near the hallway, waiting. For hesitation. For reconsideration. For something. I didn't give it to him. I walked past him, picked up the suitcase and carried it to the front door. Set it down on the porch. He followed slowly. You're making a mistake, he said. Maybe. But not the kind that leaves room for ambiguity. I'll be changing the locks tomorrow, I said. Not as a threat. As information. You don't have to do this, he said. No, I agreed. I don't. Then I opened the door and stepped aside. He didn't move immediately. He shifted tactics instead. If I leave like this, he said quietly, I'll tell people you're emotionally abusive. I looked at him, not surprised. Just confirming. You can say whatever you want, I said. The documentation will say otherwise. The transfer. The timeline. The facts. Emotion doesn't hold up against records. That's something I've learned in more than one context. He stood there for another few seconds. Then finally, he walked out. No tears. No apology. Just tension. I closed the door behind him. Locked it. And for the first time in weeks, everything felt still. Not peaceful. Not yet. But clear. The next morning I called a locksmith. Changed every exterior lock. Updated the garage code. Kept the receipt. Because clarity isn't just emotional. It's procedural. By midday, the messages started. First anger. Then disbelief. Then negotiation. We can fix this. This is too extreme. You're letting your ego ruin everything. I read them. Didn't respond. Until one line stood out. Merrick said we should create healthy distance, not this. I paused there. Read it again. Carefully, Merrick said. Not Caleb. That was the moment everything aligned. Because advice about our relationship wasn't supposed to be coming from her. Not like that. Not outside a clinical setting. Not with influence. I replied once. Just one message. If she is advising you on our relationship outside therapy, I will be contacting the licensing board. The response came almost instantly. You wouldn't dare. That's when I realized something important. He still thought this was emotional, reactive, personal. He didn't understand that I had already moved past that. This wasn't about jealousy or anger or even him. This was about process. And process doesn't hesitate. I didn't respond again. I opened my laptop and I started gathering information, not assumptions, not interpretations, facts, dates, patterns. Because if something is wrong, you don't argue it, you prove it. I didn't rush. That's the part people misunderstand when they hear this story. They assume anger drove everything that came next. It didn't. Anger is loud, it's reactive, it burns fast and leaves gaps. What I did required precision. I started with a timeline. Dates of his extended sessions. The shift from once a week to twice. The days he stayed out longer than scheduled. The calls taken outside. The language changes. Specific phrases repeated too consistently to be organic. Emotionally safe. Clarity. Growth over distraction. None of those were inherently wrong. But repetition without variation isn't natural. It's taught. I cross-referenced that with our financial records. Payment timestamps, session durations, Small discrepancies that didn't mean anything alone, but together they formed a pattern. Then I added his messages, the ones where he referenced Merrick's perspective on our relationship, the ones where therapy blurred into guidance, into influence, into something else. I organized everything into a single folder, dated, labeled, clean, no commentary, just facts. Because facts don't need interpretation if they're clear enough. Before taking any formal step, I did one thing: verification. I drafted a short email to Merrick. No emotion, no accusation, just a request. I stated that Caleb had informed me they were communicating outside scheduled sessions and that she had advised him regarding distance in our relationship. I asked whether their contact extended beyond professional boundaries and whether she was still acting as Caleb's licensed therapist. I read it twice, then sent it. She replied the next morning. The tone was controlled, measured, professional on the surface. She stated that she could not discuss a client without written consent. That part was expected. Standard. Correct. But it was the second paragraph that mattered. Therapeutic relationships can evolve, she wrote, and growth sometimes requires disruption of existing dynamics. I read that line 3 times. Therapeutic relationships can evolve. That's not neutral language. That's positioning. I forwarded the email to Caleb. Then I asked one simple question. Did you give her permission to discuss your treatment philosophy with me? No direct answer. Instead, a long message about how I was attacking the only person who supported his autonomy. Autonomy. That word again. At that point, I stopped engaging emotionally and shifted fully into procedure. I pulled the state licensing guidelines for mental health professionals in Texas. Public record. Clear language. Dual relationships with current clients are explicitly prohibited. Emotional or romantic involvement. Grounds for investigation, even if initiated by the client. I didn't need proof of anything physical. I needed evidence of boundary erosion, and I had it. The calls, the language, the influence, the email. It was enough. So I filed a formal complaint, not out of spite, out of principle. If a therapist inserts herself into a client's personal relationship and begins reframing herself as the path to clarity, that's not support. That's leverage. The submission was straightforward. Timeline, documentation, attachments. No exaggeration, no speculation. Just structure. Within 48 hours, everything shifted. Caleb called. Not text. Not a message. A call. I let it ring once before answering, not to make a point. To make sure I was calm. When I picked up, his voice was different. No edge. No superiority. Just tension. You filed a complaint, he said. Yes. A pause. You could destroy her career. If her career depends on violating professional boundaries, I said, then it deserves to be reviewed. That's not what this is, he said quickly. You're twisting it. Did you rely on her outside of therapy? I asked. Silence. Then, that's not the point. For me, it was confirmation. 2 hours later, Merrick emailed again. This time the tone had changed. Less confident, more careful. She stated that any perception of impropriety was a misunderstanding, that she valued ethics, that perhaps we could resolve this privately to avoid unnecessary escalation. Unnecessary. I read that word and closed the email. Then I replied with one line. The board will determine necessity. And I attached nothing, because I had already submitted everything where it mattered. That was the moment her authority shifted. Quietly. But permanently. What I didn't expect was how quickly Caleb's certainty collapsed. 3 days later, he showed up at the house. I had already changed the locks. He rang the bell once. Then again, not aggressively, but persistently. I opened the door, stayed inside. He stood there on the porch, shoulders slightly hunched, like something had shifted in him. You need to withdraw it, he said. No greeting, no transition, straight to it. Why? I asked. He hesitated. She reduced my sessions, he said. Said we need to create distance until things are clarified. I watched his face, not the words, the reaction behind them. She said continued contact could jeopardize her license, he added. There it was. The same person who encouraged his autonomy now needed distance. The same connection that was different now needed boundaries. Suddenly. Conveniently. So, I said slowly. She stepped back the moment there was scrutiny. That's not fair, Caleb said quickly. She's protecting her career. Exactly, I replied. That landed. He shifted his weight, looked past me, into the house, like he was trying to remember what it felt like to belong there. This went too far, he said. It went too far when your therapist became part of our relationship, I said. I didn't mean for it to happen like this. Intent. People always reach for intent when outcomes turn against them. I'm sure you didn't, I said. That didn't change anything. For the first time, his voice softened. I think I misread it, he said quietly. That was new. Not defiance. Not justification. Uncertainty. The unraveling had started. Uncertainty is louder than confidence when it finally shows up. It doesn't argue. It doesn't defend. It searches. Caleb stood on the porch like he was waiting for me to fill the silence for him. I didn't. Because this part, this realization, doesn't belong to me. It belongs to him. I didn't think it would turn into this, he said after a moment. I leaned slightly against the door frame, keeping the space between us intact. That's usually how boundary violations work, I replied. They don't announce themselves, they just shift until you're standing somewhere you didn't intend to be. He let out a breath. Slow, controlled, but not steady. She told me it was normal, he said. That emotional intensity happens in therapy, that it means I'm making progress. I watched him carefully. Did she tell you that meant building a connection outside sessions? I asked. Another pause. She said, clarity doesn't follow schedules. That phrasing again. It sounded different now. Less convincing. More like something borrowed. And you believe that, I said. It wasn't a question. He didn't answer, because there wasn't an answer that would hold up anymore. He looked down at his hands, then back at me. Can you just withdraw the complaint? He asked. There it was. Not can we fix this? Not can I come home? Just undo the consequences. I shook my head once. The complaint isn't leverage, I said. It's a response. His jaw tightened. But you could stop it. Yes, I said. I could. I let that sit for a second. Then I added, and nothing about what led to it would change. That's the part people don't like. They want resolution without accountability. He stepped closer to the threshold, not crossing it, just closer. I was confused, he said. Recovery changes things. I didn't know what was real. I agree, I said. Recovery does change people. His eyes lifted slightly, like he thought that might be agreement. It wasn't. But confusion doesn't require secrecy, I continued. It doesn't require shifting loyalty while calling it growth. That landed harder, because it removed the excuse without attacking him directly. For the first time since he arrived, he looked smaller, not physically, just less certain of the narrative he had been holding on to. I still love you, he said. There it was. Late. Not early enough to prevent anything. Just placed where it might still matter. I didn't react immediately, because love in that moment wasn't the missing variable. Clarity was. I don't doubt that, I said finally. And I didn't. But love without boundaries is just attachment. And I've seen what attachment without structure does. I think I let pride get in the way, he added, and I thought she understood me better. Understood. That word carried more weight now. Or she told you she did, I said. He didn't argue, because he couldn't. Not anymore. There was a long pause between us, the kind that used to feel comfortable. Now it just felt final. Then he asked the question I had been expecting. If you withdraw it, can I come home? There it was. Not about us. Not about rebuilding. About access? About returning to something stable now that the alternative had collapsed. I answered carefully. And no, he blinked. Once. Like he hadn't expected it to be that direct. Even if I withdraw it, I continued, the underlying issue doesn't disappear. You chose to build emotional dependence elsewhere while reframing me as an obstacle. I didn't. You did, I said, not raising my voice. Maybe not intentionally, but the outcome is the same. He went quiet. Because intention doesn't undo impact. And there's a point where explaining stops mattering. I'll be filing for divorce, I said. No emphasis. No dramatic pause. Just information. For the first time since I met him, he didn't have anything to say. No argument. No redirection. Just silence. And in that silence, there was understanding. Not agreement, but awareness. He nodded once. Slow. Then stepped back. No attempt to push further. No last effort to change the outcome. Because somewhere in the last few minutes, he realized there wasn't one. He left without another word. I closed the door. Locked it. And this time, the stillness felt different. Not just clear. Complete. The following Monday, I filed. Texas has a waiting period, which I was already aware of. So there was no urgency, no courthouse rush, just paperwork. Structured, clean, final. I retained the same attorney who had advised me on the complaint. Asset separation was straightforward. The house remained mine. The savings had already been divided. No children. No complications. Legally, it was simple. Emotionally, it wasn't chaotic either. That's what surprises people. There was no explosion at the end. No dramatic collapse. Because the collapse had already happened. Quietly. Gradually. long before either of us named it. About a month into the investigation, I received formal notice. An interim restriction had been placed on Merrick's practice pending full review. No details. Just confirmation that the complaint had weight, that it wasn't dismissed. That process was moving. A few days later, Caleb sent an email. Not a message. Not a call. An email. Long. Carefully written. He said everything unraveled faster than he expected. That Merrick had terminated him as a client. Cited conflict of interest. Recommended transferring to another provider. The same person who positioned herself as essential had stepped back the moment accountability appeared. Caleb said he felt discarded. By her, and by me. I read the email once, then replied with one paragraph. I didn't discard you. I enforced a boundary when you redirected your emotional dependence. That's not abandonment, that's consequence. I didn't block his email. I just stopped engaging beyond logistics. No late-night reflections. No revisiting decisions. Because once something is resolved, revisiting it only reopens instability. People ask me sometimes if I regret it, if I think I went too far, if I ruined their lives. I didn't fabricate anything. I didn't exaggerate. I observed. I documented. I responded. If a licensed therapist chooses to blur boundaries with a client and insert herself into a personal relationship under the language of growth, that's her decision. If my partner chooses to participate in that dynamic while living in my house, that's his. My decision was simpler. I refused to support it. Now the house is quiet again. The routines are predictable. The locks are mine. And for the first time in a long time, nothing feels like it's shifting beneath me.